Alright, today we are going to just keep going with the angle relationships that we've been talking about. So we talked about corresponding angles, alternate interior, and alternate exterior angles. Okay? We said all of those relationships, the angle measures are going to be exactly the same. Another one that we've already talked about, where we said the angles would have to be the same, are vertical angles. And then we said consecutive interior angles would have to be supplementary. And then another one that we already talked about a while ago was linear pairs. Okay? Linear pairs have to add up to 180. Okay, so just real quick review on those different relationships. Okay? Let's corresponding angles. We can start with that. Corresponding means in the same position, just on the other line. So these two angles would be an example.
Mr. Fach, you're interrupting all these conversations with your teaching.
I know. Angles that are in the same position, just on the other line, are corresponding angles. Okay? Corresponding angles have to have the same measure. Now, hopefully these relationships start to make sense, because the only options we have in something like this, when we have parallel lines, is that either they're equal to each other or they add to 180. Okay? If I look at these two angles here, they're both fairly large angles, right? They're both obtuse. There's no way for me to add two large angles together and get 180. Okay, so if we're thinking in terms of our only two options are either they're equal to each other or they add to 180, hopefully it starts to become easy to see which ones add to 180 and which ones are equal to each other. Alternate interior then, remember, are angles that are on opposite sides of the transversal. That's the alternate part. And then interior on the inside of my two lines. Alternate exterior then, okay, is opposite sides of the transversal, but on the outside of my two lines. Okay, and all three of those relationships, the angles are equal. Then, another one that we already talked about was vertical. And remember, vertical just means right across from each other when we have a pair of intersecting lines. So these two angles would be an example of vertical angles. Then the two supplementary relationships that we've talked about. Consecutive interior. So consecutive interior angles would be on the same side of the transversal, both on the inside. Okay, and here we can see, well, I've got one angle that's obtuse and one angle that's acute. Okay, there's no way for those two angles to be equal to each other. So they would have to add to 180, right? If we're thinking our only two options in a picture like this are either the two angles add to 180, or they're equal to each other, well, these would have to add to 180. And then the other final relationship that we've talked about in the past is a linear pair. Okay, a linear pair is two angles that are right next to each other, right? They're adjacent, and they make up a straight line together. So these angles would be an example of a linear pair, and they would add to 180. Okay? So the first 6 questions on this sheet are just asking us to find measures of angles, and oops, I guess I put an equation on number 1. So first, let's identify the name of the relationship, okay, and then figure out what that means in each of these questions. So remember, if we have the same number of arrows on two lines, that tells me they're parallel. Right? So I'm told that these two lines are parallel here. So the two angles I'm looking at are this 70-degree angle and this 8x minus 2 angle. What would the name of the relationship be between those first? Alternate exterior. Right? They're alternate because they're on opposite sides of the transversal, and exterior because they're outside of these two lines. So let's label this as alternate exterior. Now, are alternate exterior angles equal to each other, or do they add to 180? Are alternate exterior angles equal to each other, or do they add to 180?
I'm going to take yes and say they equal each other.
They're equal to each other, right? That's, I mean, we said, that's a relationship that you can memorize, but also if we're just thinking in terms of, there's only two options, right? Either the two angles are equal to each other or they add to 180. Well, these are two acute angles. Okay, there's no way for me to have two acute angles that add to 180. So they would have to be equal to each other. So if I have an expression, like 8x minus 2 instead of just a number, well, I'm just going to set these two things equal to each other. So my setup to solve this equation is going to be 8x minus 2 equals 7. So then we just have a simple equation to solve. Add 2 to both sides, divide by 8, and we get x equals 9. Okay, so if we're given expressions, we're just thinking in terms of, well, either I'm going to set two expressions equal to each other, or I'm going to add them together and set them equal to 180. Okay, so if I look at number 2, first of all, what's the name of the relationship between the 128 and the question mark? What would the name of the relationship between these two angles be? Alternate interior. Okay. They're on opposite sides of the transversal, and they're both on the inside of my two parallel lines. So now, what's the relationship between those two angles? Are they equal to each other, or do they have 180? Equal to each other. Right? So if this one's 128, this one would be 128. Okay, how about number 3? What would the name of the relationship between these two be?
The one above it.
It's, same idea as the one above it, right? Alternate exterior. So, what would the measure of this angle be? 71. Right? Alternate exterior angles are equal to each other. How about in number 4? What would the name of that relationship be? Vertical. Right? These are vertical angles. So what is my missing angle? Right? If this one's 88, this one's 88. Vertical angles are the same. Okay, then numbers 5 and 6. Where are we looking? This, it's 71 degrees for number 3 there. So for number 5,
131.
yes, this would be 131 degrees. So what's the name of the relationship between those? Interior is part of it. It's going to be consecutive interior. Why is it consecutive and not alternate?
They're on the same side.
They're on the same side. Right? If these two angles are on the same side of the transversal, they're consecutive. If they're on opposite sides, they're alternate. And then number 6, What's the name of the relationship here?
Corresponding. That's when they equal 180.
So-
what?
Yeah, you're right. These two will add to 180.
What do we call it?
If two angles make up a straight line together,
You remember?
not vertical,
He said
Linear.
linear pair. Okay? If two angles are right next to each other, yeah, so this would be 64. If they're right next to each other and they share a side and make up a straight line, they are a linear pair. And we know linear pairs add to 180. So I could just say these two angles would add to 180. 180 minus 116 is 64. Okay. So the rest of the sheet then is going to be setting up and solving equations using this idea, or these ideas. I guess we have multiple ideas here. So in these diagrams, we really only have two options, right? Either we're adding the two angles together and setting them equal to 180, or we're setting them equal to each other, right? We're just using these relationships here. So do you guys want to go through a couple more together, or do you feel like you can identify these relationships and you can try these on your own? Yeah, just solve it. Alright, yeah, it looks like most of you are trying these and ready to go, so why don't we just go ahead and start working on these? Miss Graham and I will be around to help. Okay, so go ahead and